Yeah.
Hello? Yeah, it's fine.
Josh, they don't have only me. Oh, it's not. So you would make it feel better.
I haven't got the dress code.
I want to bring this up different They didn't have to tell me here.
We're at General Block. Are you in Pittsburgh? Or?
DC. They don't have a Pittsburgh office, so I'm in DC. I live in Pittsburgh, but I drive down every week for a couple days.
You have a place down here? Oh, wait, down in what?
I stay with family and stuff. So what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Brent has his airspace.
Yeah.
Yeah, and big questions like where are we now?
Yeah.
Reality height. Our current regulatory is adequate.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for coming. We're really excited to kick this panel off. We've got an awesome set of panelists here. Before we get started, anybody who is interested in joining the Harvard Law and Technology Society, please come talk to me afterwards. We are recruiting a couple new board members this year. We have 7 symposiums planned, including one in Warsaw in this coming calendar year. A lot of exciting events. We look at both directions of the relationship between law and technology, both tech law and a wide range of legal tech ideas. So come talk to me. This panel is co-sponsored by the Federalist Society. So I'll hand this over to Douglas.
Thanks, JP. I'm Douglas Colby. I'm the president of Harvard FedSoc.
The Federalist Society is a group of conservative, moderate, and libertarian lawyers and law students who stand for three principles. First, the state exists to preserve freedom. Second, the separation of powers is central to our Constitution. And third, it is emphatically the province and duty of the judiciary to say what the law is and not what it should be. We're really excited to co-sponsor this event, and I'll hand it over to Ryan Geruso to introduce the panelists.
Thanks, Douglas. Hi, everybody. I will be moderating the panel today. With us, we have Brent Skorup, a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. His research areas include telecommunications, transportation technology, regulation, and wireless policy. He's the author of a Mercatus working paper, Auctioning Airspace, which he discussed in his Wall Street Journal op-ed, Your Flying Car Will Be Here Sooner Than You Think, and in the Air Traffic Management magazine essay, How Best to Share the New Highways in the Sky. He serves on numerous government advisory committees. His work has been cited by multiple agencies and courts, and he has authored pieces and appeared on numerous media outlets. Also joining us is Gregory Walden, a partner at McGuire Woods, and a national authority in the aviation and government ethics space. Gregory served as chief counsel at the FAA, as associate deputy attorney general with the U.S. Department of Justice, and as transition ethics counsel for President-elect George W. Bush, in addition to numerous other government positions. In the aviation space, he counsels citizen groups on matters pending before the FAA, U.S. Department of Transportation, National Transportation Safety Board, Transportation Security Administration, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and Congress. And finally, Jeffrey Immel, an associate at Jenner & Block in the aviation and aerospace practice, where he counsels clients in traditional and emerging aviation technologies, the evolving unmanned aerial systems regulatory landscape, as well as vehicle and program certification, development and implementation of safety management systems, and accident and incident response. Prior to practicing law, Mr. Immel served as lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy, piloting both F-18E and F Super Hornets and F-14 Tomcats, including in combat in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. I'd like to start with our first topic. Where are we now? We read a substantial amount of press about the various programs that are underway. I'm thinking specifically about Amazon, UPS, package delivery. We read a lot about this stuff, but we hear very little about how they mesh with the current regulatory scheme or what changes might be necessary or even presumed within some of these programs. So in other words, what is your assessment of the reality versus the hype? And if we could just go down from left to right here, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to JP and the Federalist Society for having me. It's great to be here. The reality versus hype. So, and I want to differentiate drones from urban air mobility, passenger drones. On the drone front, there are many companies around the world doing drone deliveries, and the FAA is working to certify these. UPS was recently certified as an air carrier to do deliveries in the U.S. There's a lot of hype. There's also a lot of potential. This idea of getting packages that would take 30 minutes or an hour in traffic, you could do it in minutes, in mere minutes, at a low cost. So a lot of potential, a lot of hype around drones. On urban air mobility, yeah, this is a fascinating area people aren't following as well. Also, a tremendous amount of hype. By some measures, there are 200, and these are, if you're not familiar, passenger drones that carry 1 to 6 people typically, often electric. There are hybrid versions, but there are about 200 designs out there around the world. Tremendous amount of hype, more investment, including major players like Boeing, Airbus, Uber, and most of those 200 companies will not survive, unfortunately. The certification process, which many civil aviation agencies are trying to formalize, is onerous. You just burn cash as you wait for years for certification. But there's a lot of interest. And actually, I saw yesterday, there's one company that kind of stands out, is Ehang in China. They have a 2-passenger autonomous vehicle. They've been flying tourists for months now, and the regulator is approving them for commercial services. And already, they said yesterday, they've made their second batch of deliveries to enterprise customers. And so this is moving quite quickly, especially in areas outside the U.S.
Outside the U.S.,
Yeah.
exactly, because I think passenger drones in the United States, years away, years away. Right now, you can operate drones within the visual line of sight, and you can do that commercially. Yeah, the aeronautical knowledge test is very simple. So for real estate and for some photography, cinematography, that's fine. You want to go beyond visual line of sight, you've got to get a waiver from the FAA, and that takes between 30 days or 90 days. Comes with a lot of restrictions. So the reality is some people are making money right now, but they're not really making money on package delivery because Wing, part of Alphabet, and UPS Flight Forward are the only two companies in the United States that can do package delivery for compensation or higher. The FAA is working on a rulemaking it very slowly to have a rule that authorizes drone air carriers that isn't as onerous as what United and Delta had to go through or have to go through to maintain their certificate. So package delivery commonplace is maybe a year away or 2 years away. Passenger drones, 5 or 6.
Oh yeah, by the time it gets to me, I just say I agree. Don't know, but no, but I will say I think Greg is exactly right. Is there's almost two levels, right? Drones are routinized. Commercial use of drones is fairly routinized now for real estate or things like that, but you are highly constrained in what you can do. What the press and what we focused on is that second level, right? Is now we want to get into complex operations. We want to fly beyond visual line of sight. We want to fly over people. We want to deliver packages. That, hype versus reality, I think. I mean, there's a lot of hype. You look at UPS, right, and they just got their certificate, which is a big deal. I mean, they are now certificated as a Part 135 carrier, the same that any manned aircraft would be, right? But that comes with a host of operational restrictions from exemptions from the existing rules. So what they say essentially is we can't meet certain rules. We need an exemption from it. Then the FAA turns around and says, okay, well, if you want those exemptions, you have to comply with these operational rule restrictions, right? And so it's still not out the door, you can just go ahead and do it, right? You still have a certain number of exemptions. The next step will be how do you make those exemptions not necessary, right? How do you get the regulations and rules to allow these type of operations so that you can just do it as part of course the way that you would if you were a manned operation. That is a difficult concept. I think they're working toward it. A year or two is, that's reasonable. It's going to be a tough road, but there has been progress made. But there is a lot more progress to be made.
All right, well, that walks us into a different topic here that is, you mentioned that EHang is already flying aircraft and a relatively burdensome process here. Is our current regulatory system adequate? So the FAA is not necessarily the most innovative body in the world, but they've done a pretty good job with aviation safety, and that's probably where we want it. So should we consider other regulatory options, other systems or structures that might favor more innovation, such as aerial corridor leases perhaps, and what potential downsides could those options bring with them?
Well, I can start. Well, the question of FAA is a combination of do they have structures or programs that will work with 21st century technology, and also do they have the resources? I think they have the resources, and I think they are now moving towards partnerships with industry that will really move them forward. The big question mark is whether the Boeing 737 MAX, the FAA has been bruised by it and maybe will be bruised more as the reports come out on those 2 fatal accidents. And if that causes Congress or the public to say, we don't want the FAA to work as closely with industry on giving some certification responsibilities, even not the last sign-off, that may spill over and hurt the drone industries. But the FAA is working on a certification model that deals with reliability and durability. So if your drone is a certain weight, if you go 500 or 1,000 or 200 hours without 2,000 hours without any failure that is not otherwise contained, okay, good, we're going to give you the okay. And that's still in draft form, but the FAA doesn't want to go through 5 to 7 year type certification, airworthiness certification with drones, not small drones. That would kill the industry, and it is really is a hamper on industry right now.
No, I think that's right. I think the FAA has recognized that it needs to update the way that it does these things, right? And it does it not by wholesale throwing things out and saying, well, we'll just start over. It does it by doing, what Greg is saying, hey, we'll take our type certification and we'll do, modify that. Its durability, reliability. How can it work for you? And I think that does it. One of the examples is I think the FAA has embraced performance-based standards a lot in this area. Traditionally, that wasn't necessarily the case, in that they would say, if you want to be certificated, here's what you meet. You meet these rules, right? They were technology prescriptive in a lot of instances, and where they would say, if you want to operate, you need a transponder. It has to meet these requirements. You have to have ADSB out. It has to meet these requirements. You have to have a radio. It has to meet these requirements. And what the drone operators came around and said, well, why is that the case, right? Why can't you certify or allow us to operate based on what our drone can do? So rather than say you need to have ADSB out, what is the purpose of ADSB out? What do you want us to do? And then can we have other technologies to meet that, right? And I think the FAA has started to embrace that, and you see that in the rulemaking is very performance-based standards and less prescriptive and less technology-based. I think that is, in my opinion, that's been it's helped the industry a lot. Because, like I say, I don't think you can just throw it out. And I don't know that you want to just throw out things and say, let's just start over. And that's not what you're saying we are. But, I mean, the FAA, it may not win awards for innovation, but it does have the safest airspace in the history of the world. I mean, right? Like when you get on an airplane, when I get on an airplane today, go home, that will be the safest place that I will be in the entire day in that airplane, right? And so they are invested in not throwing that out. And so I think they've done a good job. I think there's more work to be done, but I think innovation is a piecemeal step.
In short, no. Our current regulatory systems and law are not well equipped to handle the fast-moving technology in the drone and urban air mobility and autonomous vehicles and these other areas where that often move at the speed of software, and agencies don't move at that speed, not nearly. On the plus side, as Jeffrey mentioned, regulators seem to get it. They seem to understand that the old ways of doing things can really hinder innovation and safety and competition in these industries, and performance-based standards is one way of expediting approvals and certification. And this is a global phenomenon. It's not just in the U.S. The problem is, even with performance-based standards, Part 23, which is for light aircraft or small aircraft, it took 10 years to create an amendment to that. And that's just not good enough for a drone company or urban air mobility company. And this is aside from the technology requirements. And my concern, as was mentioned, I've been looking at how do you integrate thousands or millions of drones and urban air mobilities into regulated airspace, and there's a lot of unanswered questions. One on the technology side, also on the legal side. You guys are on the Uniform Law Commission, right?
The Drone Tort Committee.
Okay. Just the question of aerial property rights. There's a case in Washington State right now about aerial trespass for a drone flying over property. This is an issue states haven't dealt with in a while. Many states dealt with this decades ago and created what's called navigational easements to allow flight. But with drones, it's a whole new issue. And I'll just mention it. This idea of aerial corridors for urban air mobility, and even for drones, you see companies wanting corridors, just fixed routes that they can program easily, own the entire stack of technology, and I think regulators should lean into this, and one way of doing that would be exclusive aerial corridors for urban air mobility companies. I think drones are a different story.
I would just say we've been spending a lot of time looking at the aircraft, the vehicle, and the certification of that. But with manned aviation, you have air traffic controllers separating, deconflicting, giving clearances. You won't have that with drones at low altitudes. Instead, what is being contemplated is an unmanned traffic management system, UTM, called Uspace in Europe. And it's going to be the cloud that will deconflict strategically and maybe even tactically once the aircraft are equipped with sense and avoid or detect and avoid equipment, that you will be able to, on your smartphone, be able to identify a drone flying over you, not with a name and an address and a phone number, but with an identifier that you can notify the local police or sheriff or the FAA if the drone is operating in a way that invades your privacy or violates the regulation. So remote identification, that rulemaking process is very slow, but it is moving, and the technology we think is there. So the regulatory system is slow, is adapting. The regulations themselves, the standards themselves, are moving.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, and I agree with Brent. I think one of the reasons we're here is because way back when they decided to start regulating this, the FAA said drones are aircraft, and so now they fit into all the rules that we have for aircraft. But it really is a square peg in a round hole, right? And I'll give you an example. To operate under VFR or IFR, you are required. The pilot in command is required to see and avoid aircraft. Okay, well, with a drone, there is no pilot in command that's going to see and avoid them because they're flying beyond visual line of sight, and so you leave it off to the sense and avoid systems in the aircraft to do that. Well, how do you tackle that, right? And so, on a very real sense, I think Brent's right. The regulations are not designed to do this, right? They're not designed necessarily to do that. But how do you change those? I think it's a long process, and I agree with that.
So then on this topic of finding ways to improve the process, what would be something that perhaps could change in, say, the next 12 months that would produce, in your opinion, the largest positive impact on this industry and technological progress in general?
I'll say for my part, I've been writing about and meeting with state lawmakers proposing that they stand up aviation or emerging aviation technology task forces, similar to what many states did with autonomous vehicles, just to get stakeholders, commercial sector, public interest groups, regulators to talk about these issues. I mean, there will be, unlike in the past, there will be a major role for state and local authorities to be involved in this area, if only for the infrastructure required of drone ports and vertiports. For urban air mobility, you'll need electrical grid upgrades. There are nuisance laws, there are noise laws, there are zoning issues, and states and localities are not well prepared to do this. And so, in the short term, the next year, I'll keep banging this drum for lawmakers that they should, just to get a grasp of what the issues are, because I'm sure new things will arise, just as they did for autonomous vehicles once you have all the stakeholders or many of the stakeholders getting together.
I think from my perspective, what is actually in the pipe now, the FAA is trying to finalize a remote ID rule for drones, which will allow you to identify the drone that is flying beyond visual line of sight. That is the linchpin, they say, for everything that's going to happen, right? So once we can make sure that we can identify the drone, then we can start allowing beyond visual line of sight. We can start making rules for flying over people, right? We can start making air carrier type rules for things drone specific. So that needs to come out, and I think they need to take a look. The industry needs to take a look at that and see how it works. They say it's going to come out in November now, but that's been pushed back a couple times, so hopefully it will. But I say that's the linchpin to a lot of other rules that the dominoes will fall. So we're looking at that.
The remote ID proposed rule is expected this fall. That's just a proposed rule. The APA, notice and comment rulemaking. We're looking at a final rule probably not until latter part of 2020. But I think the FAA is working with industry to have drones that are equipped with remote ID be in advance of the final rule to perhaps get expedited approvals on your waivers, because you will have a greater margin of safety and accountability with remote ID.
And I'll add one other issue. It's intriguing, this idea of aerial property rights. I mentioned the trespass lawsuit. This has not been sorted out. Where does property right? Where does your property begin and federally controlled airspace end? And that's not been sorted out. The Cosby case, which is a 1940s case, the Supreme Court said that landowners own the immediate reaches above their property. No one knows what the immediate reaches are, and this wasn't a big deal in a world of traditional aircraft, traditional airliners. But in a world of drones, where drones can fly at very low altitudes, immediate reaches gains a whole new salience, and this has not been sorted out. FAA and states for now have kind of kicked this issue down the road, but it'll be relevant when you start having widespread commercial drone delivery.
So if I just add on to that, so Cosby was a takings case. The United States government was held responsible for low-flying aircraft during World War II. What the restatement did is they took that takings case and developed an aerial trespass tort. And that's what Brent's talking about, the immediate reaches. And that aerial trespass tort says, okay, if an aircraft is flying beneath or in the immediate reaches and substantially interferes with use and enjoyment of property, okay, now you've got a tort. Jeff and I were at the drone tort committee trying to say, okay, what is aerial trespass for drones? And property rights interests said there should be no requirement that there be substantial interference. Trespass is a dignitary tort, and you don't need to prove any damage. You just recover. Well, if you have that rule in state or local jurisdictions, there will be no drone operations. A city can say, no drones. Now, there still is, in the FAA had the big airspace grab a couple years ago and said we have jurisdiction down to the ground. Well, why? Well, because drones can take off from anywhere on the ground, unlike manned aircraft that require airports or heliports, and therefore we have jurisdiction on the ground. What we have been saying as industry is, okay, the FAA, we don't want to have that. Where does the FAA end? Where does the FAA end and state and local or private interests? No, FAA jurisdiction goes down to the ground, but it does not displace reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions under police power authority, which is zoning, which is identification of airports. I'm not saying it's easy, but there's a way in which everyone could get along.
It seems in that discussion specifically of property rights and how far they go, that there's also, maybe not in the package context, but in other contexts, there's also a serious privacy implication here. I don't particularly like it if my neighbor is flying a drone even exactly on my property line, but he's doing it just high enough that he can spy on me while I'm having a barbecue. How does that factor in here? Is that a critical concern, or is that something that will kind of wash off as this system becomes more commonplace?
Well, the FAA has said specifically we don't want to, they've said we don't want to deal with privacy, right? That's something for other people to deal with. So I don't think you'll see the FAA get involved with that. But it is an issue. I think in certain parts in certain ways it's not an issue, right? I mean, what's the difference between a person flying a drone looking at your barbecue or someone standing on the second floor of their house watching you take a barbecue, right? What's the difference between someone with a camera taking a video of you or a drone taking a video of you? In certain ways, the law tries not to be technology specific, right? It tries to be technology agnostic, right? The law of torts doesn't say, but there's not a law of automobile torts, for example, right? There's a law of torts with certain exceptions. But I think that is really what we're working for, is how do drones really impact privacy, right? You can say, well, I don't want drones to take pictures, right? Well, drones are a little bit interesting because a lot of times they need to take pictures in order to operate, right? They need that sense and avoid to take pictures. What do they do with those pictures? How do they keep them? Those are all things that can be regulated, but I think in the larger context of what is already out there to do this, right? I think making up new rules like the tort law for drones wasn't necessarily the best idea because there were things already out there that these could be put into without shoehorning them into, right, that they could be used. So, I mean, it certainly is an issue, but I think we need to take a look at how they actually change what is already out there.
I'd say remote identification will give accountability, and that will be have an effect on drone operators right now that they can just operate anywhere and they can spy on a neighbor and not be concerned that they're going to be held to account. Once you get remote identification, that should operate to discourage that sort of activity. Well, the FAA doesn't do privacy; they don't do Windows, but Europe with the GDPR and California with the California Consumer Protection, those privacy regimes are going to apply to drone operators to the extent the drone operators collect data. But if data is for navigational purposes and is used only for navigational purposes, there shouldn't be any concern with privacy responsibility. But if you're a landowner, you don't know whether someone is taking a picture and what they're taking a picture of, and we're going to have to test this out through court cases. But again, the regulatory regime is going to be overarching over all industries, and is going to capture drones and driverless cars into that net.
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, this raises, of course, Fourth Amendment issues and Carpenter-like interests and what government can subpoena or get with a warrant from private companies. And but yeah, otherwise, I echo what was said. I mean, the FAA is largely delegating this to state level, and states are putting privacy laws in, or saying we have existing privacy laws and peeping tom laws that would apply in this context.
So we've made a lot of comparisons to the autonomous vehicles landscape, the technologies there, and the development of the industry. But this time last year, we were largely promised that autonomous vehicles were right around the corner, and that was at the top of every headline. GM was saying that we're going to start producing vehicles without steering wheels. 12 months later, it looks very, very different, and it almost seems like a lot of that autonomous hype has then moved on to this space. So as we make comparisons to the AV space, how does it compare? Where are there distinctions? And what ought we to learn about the AV's case that might be applicable here?
Yeah, I'll say there's an innovation hype chart, and there's a trough of disillusionment at some point before, I forget what plateau of innovation or whatever. But I mean, yeah, AVs I would say are in that trough of disillusionment. Although I mean, it should be said, this week I saw on the self-driving car Reddit in the Phoenix area, Waymo announced that they would offer autonomous vehicles with no safety driver to certain customers, which is exciting. The analogs to autonomous vehicles, I think it's Sebastian Thrun. He was at Waymo for a while. Now he's doing an autonomous aviation company, an urban air mobility company. He said a few weeks ago he thinks urban air mobility become mass service before autonomous vehicles, and I think I tend to agree. The issue with autonomous vehicles is that you have to deal with other drivers and other driver behavior, and you don't have quite that problem in the air, especially the altitudes we're talking about for urban air mobility, a few hundred feet in the air. There aren't too many other operators there, so it's just a much cleaner environment in which to operate. And I mean, the market demand is there. There were air taxi services with helicopters in New York City in the '60s. They were doing hundreds of thousands of customers a year, fairly inexpensively. So the demand is there. The technology is getting there. The certification is an issue. I think the air traffic management is a big issue and something I plan to write more about. But no, there are some similarities. I think there are some big differences as well.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think it's from an engineering standpoint, right? Like on the ground, if the AV sees something, what is it supposed to be there? Is it a person? Is it another car? Is it moving toward me? Do I need to avoid it? What do I need to do? But in the air, if something's there, well, get out of the way, right? It's not supposed to be there. And so that makes it a little simpler. But there are a lot of difficult things based on the speed. You have to see tiny little, it turns out it's very difficult to see tiny little wires, right? Like, power lines and things like that. So it is difficult. It's not simple. It's not totally simple, but it is, that way. I think in a larger context too, what you see now is cross-pollination of transportation modes as a whole almost. I think, it used to be when you wanted to deliver a package, it was, I want a package, and you didn't care how it got there necessarily, but it traveled on the boat, right? And then it got on the truck, and then it got on the plane. And all those were different, and they were regulated differently. But now, with companies starting to integrate, right, the company almost from the very beginning, it's irrelevant to it. It just says, I want it to go from A to B, and then it goes, right? And so you see, well, is that if it's, when it gets on the plane, when do aviation regulations start to apply to it? When does the other things start to apply? And so you see cross-pollination. You see things taken from aviation industry into transportation industry. A good example, I think, is SMS, right? I think you see AV companies that are talking about automobiles have learned a lot from safety management systems of airlines, right? They're very robust, they're regulated a lot of times, and they have these very detailed ways of dealing with safety issues. And that's starting to mitigate, to go over into other places in the transportation sector as well, which I think is a good thing. So there's a lot to learn on both sides, I think. And the more that they become integrated, where it's just A to B, right? I don't really care how I get there. I click on Uber. Uber says you're going to go there, and it takes me first to the heliport. Then I get on the helicopter. Then I get off the helicopter. Then I get back on the train. Like that kind of thing will expedite that.
I think with passenger drones, you're going to have noise impacts that you don't see with small drones. Just within the last 10 years, the FAA put in some restrictions on helicopter operations around Long Island. And that was an expansion of the FAA's jurisdiction over noise, and it was upheld by the courts. And so I expect members of Congress to be pressuring the FAA to put noise restrictions on passenger drones. They will come naturally from local jurisdictions, and what kind of rule will be set up on that, I don't know, but that is going to be something that I think will slow down passenger drones. But I don't know who's going to go first. I think driverless, I would think the airspace, and you're the pilot, I think the airspace is more forgiving. You go on, you're moving at very fast speeds, but if there's right-of-way rules that are not as complicated as everything that has to be done to avoid a pedestrian, or to think it's a pedestrian, it's a bicycle, or otherwise. And those things need to be sorted out once you are off the straight streets in Scottsdale and onto the Pennsylvania Turnpike.
It's a big sky, little plane theory, right? It's a big sky, it's a little plane, so you can kind of do what you need to do to avoid it, yeah.
So the American legal system is an adversarial legal system. And so as you're looking for these changes that you want to see to further innovation, who are the individuals or groups or interests that are maybe opposed to these advances or would like to see changes or a different approach taken? Where's the most pushback coming from, and what's that motivated from, and how do you expect to overcome that?
Well, I work for the Small UAV Coalition, so you know where I stand. But if there has been the other side, ALPA, the Airline Pilots Association, we were there first, and if you're going to come into our airspace, you're going to comply with our rules. ALPA has opposed almost every waiver request to do package delivery that's been filed with the FAA. On the state and local industry interests, the National League of Cities, the Conference of Mayors, have wanted to preserve and enhance local interests and rights over drone things. But I think the airlines are not as opposed to drones. When the drones are going to be in the same airspace as United or Southwest, they are going to be equipped. And they are going to comply with manned aviation regulations for the most part. And so the airlines are not as concerned, but the pilots, general aviation pilots and crop dusters, medevacs, they are in low-level airspace and where drones are going to be operated. And so there's been some tension there.
Yeah, I think, I mean, like I said, I think the FAA is largely, and regulators largely understand it. They want to innovate. They want to let these businesses do what they need to do, right? Because it doesn't do anyone any good, particularly them, to stand in the way. So they get it. I think what you will see, and it's been alluded to several times now, is the next layer will be the local and state governments, right? Is how do they actually allow these things to happen? They have laws. They have traditional police powers, which they can use in these instances, which the FAA has said they can. Right, so there will be the preemption argument, right? To say the FAA preempts what from the ground? Where does the airspace go? Where does it stop? We want to regulate certain things. The FAA will say no. We can regulate we can regulate the operations. We can regulate the airspace. You can't. You have to be limited to your traditional police powers. But I think those police powers can be expansive, right? I mean, zoning rules, for example. New York has essentially outlawed rooftop heliports, right? That's fine. The FAA doesn't outlaw it, but the state and local regulations have had an impact on it. So I think how those things work, noise restrictions, when you can fly, where you can take off of, what the heliport has to look like, all those kind of things are going to be state and local issues that you're going to see pushback on. I mean, as a naval aviator, right, I flew very loud aircraft, and people were very upset about it, and we were continually, I wasn't, the Navy was continually in litigation about citizens concerned against jet noise, right? We don't want to hear it. You will see, I'm assuming, and you probably already have, certain things like that, right? Like it's just too noisy. We don't want to see them. There are too many drones. They're ruining the way that things look, right? We have rights to the aesthetics. And those things, I'm not minimizing those. I think those are the things that are going to come up, and you're going to have to figure it out.
Yeah, I would echo what's already been said. And maybe I'm in a technology policy bubble. I don't see any intractable opposition. I mean, the state and local issues are starting to bubble up. They at least want a seat at the table, some input into this. But I mean, in some ways, it resembles what happened in telecommunications, say 20 years ago, when cellular systems started getting built out, and for the first time, state and localities were involved in a big way in zoning and permits for telecommunications. There are some privacy advocates resisting, but I suspect when people see the benefits of drone delivery, for instance, I don't think that will be an intractable problem. One thing, I mean, noise issues constantly come up in aviation, as you can imagine, and that is one that could grind a lot of this to a halt. I will say one thing. My colleagues Eli Dorado and Raymond Russell wrote a paper a couple years ago about complaints to the FAA about airport noise, and you see, and I think it was the first time anyone had done this, but for the publicly available data, you see this kind of power law asymmetry where you have often a handful of people, in some cases 1 or 2 people, composing 80 to 90% of airport noise complaints. And clearly these people, these folks have some anguish over airport noise. I mean, they're calling the FAA or the airport a dozen times a day, but it seems to be, in many cases, a very small number of people. And localities and aviation regulators need to be aware and identify, is this really a mass, a general problem, or is this a few people who have sensitivities? In some cases, these were people, I think in Denver, 80% of calls were from someone 60 miles from the airport who's calling dozens of times a day about airport noise. So it's a serious issue, but more work needs to be done on identifying the extent of the problem.
I agree. I would add too, I think one of the interesting points we're talking about now is this largely theoretical still, is that they're not actually out there. Right, you don't see these drones delivering packages. They're not noisy yet to you. So people are thinking about it in the theoretical. I think what is incumbent upon industry is to show the uses and utility of those drones, right? Because I think we've seen, I mean, your phone is incredibly invasive, right? It's talk about destroying privacy. It knows everything about you at all times, but people like it because it's exceptionally useful, right? There's an enormous amount of utility to it. So I think it's incumbent upon the industry to show that utility, because if people really like the drones and you can get a package in 2.5 minutes or whatever, right? The the concerns over privacy or noise may start to diminish, right? Because it is so useful.
So I'd like to pivot the discussion a little bit towards how the regulatory system might interact with business models of certain companies in this space. And specifically, should we fear an Uber equivalent, or even in this case, because Uber Elevate is in this space, they might try to do a similar thing. And specifically what I mean is there's a host of companies, Uber, Lyft, Airbnb come to mind, that largely just skirted local and state level rules. They claimed that they didn't apply, or that there were certain exemptions, and they kind of just slid underneath the radar through their growth phase. And then once they reach that critical mass, then they start to actually play ball, and they say, well, let's actually call ourselves transportation network companies, and let's do a whole new list of rules. So should we fear companies looking at this space and saying the actual better business model is to slide under the radar, break a few rules at first, and then get that critical mass? Or will this case be different?
Aviation is different. For cars, the federal government puts out the safety standard, and then Ford builds it and operates. Ford doesn't have to get a permit or a certificate from NHTSA the way United or Boeing has to get a certificate from the FAA. You will not see Uber Elevate conduct itself as Uber did in terms of, break glass and then let's pick up the pieces. No, they've got to go through the steps. And the question is, are those steps going to be adaptable to new technology so that business can develop on a reasonable time frame?
I agree. I think air carriers, right? There's advantages to being regulated as an air carrier, right? I mean, you are under the FAA safety program, the DOT Economic Authority program, right? You have all that. I think that's why when you get on a plane, you don't necessarily care that it's United or Delta or that it's being operated by Republic Airline, because you know that the FAA has certificated that airplane and that operator to operate to the standards of everyone else, right? And so you can trust that. I think in this space, the operators understand that, right? And they do not want to break rules, and they don't want to be seen as unsafe, because they want you to feel that they are as safe as traditional manned aviation, right? That is important to their business, right? I mean, even for package delivery, you're not going to hire them, or you're not going to get it if you know that they're not safe, or that they've skirted the rules, or the FAA has said you're not ready. You probably won't use them, right? So they don't want to do that. I think, in particularly for when you get to urban air mobility and you're actually people on board, I can't imagine that they would say, oh, we didn't care, right? Just go ahead and get on, but we'll pick it up later. I think their business model will rely upon them making sure that they can say correctly, FAA is bought off, right? The FAA is bought off, and we are safe as everyone else. And I think that's important to them.
So does that then conflict with what would be the venture-backed funding model of most technology startups in the space? Brent, you alluded to bringing out the software methodologies into this space. Do those two things contradict each other? Do they conflict? Are they incompatible? Or is there a way forward where a venture-backed startup that is reliant on growth metrics, could that business model work in this space, and how?
Yeah, as I indicated at the beginning, I think you'll see this industry now that aircraft are being built and tested. You'll see a winnowing out of those 200 designs to not much less than 200 designs, just because the certification process is expensive and fairly onerous. Again, I keep going back to it. I'm concerned about the current process of the FAA and NASA, which is looking at air traffic management for these urban air mobility companies and drones, just putting all of these onto a single system, an interoperable system. In information-rich networks like that, it becomes extremely difficult to upgrade that system. If you know the next-gen upgrades to traditional air traffic control, It's years behind schedule, billions over budget, and it's hard to find someone say a nice thing about it. I mean, that's a symptom of the problem, where you have a tightly integrated system that all providers, including competitors, have to be on. And to me, that one of the biggest issues will be how do you integrate these companies in a federated way and manage air traffic?
I think it's a really interesting question. I think from a tactical perspective, when these first started, what you saw on the intercompany level was a lot of the engineers were not aviation at all, right? They were robotics engineers, right, or computer vision engineers. And so they had an idea of, we work on this time frame, right? We iterate quickly. Then you had the old aviation people inside saying, well, guys, wait, no, this is not the way you do it, right? You need to test. I need test cars. I need to certify it. You're going to go out and fly that? Well, hold on. How are we going to maintain safe? And in intercompany, there was they were not getting along well. And so the companies learned how to deal with that, right? And then it was to the regulators, right? Is how do we prepare ourselves as an innovation company, but at the same time recognize that we need to be regulated according to what you say. And they got along with that. And now I think they get along. And it's an interesting question. And I don't have the answer to it. To the next step is, can a business model that is focused on growth, exist in this? I think it can. I think it depends on the business model and what you're doing, but that's above my pay grade, I guess, to answer that question.
I don't think companies are going to be turning profits quickly. So the Amazon wing, Intel, and Uber, they put a lot of money and they know they're not going to turn it around quickly. For much smaller companies, there have been a number of startups in the drone front from people who made a lot of money working at Google or Amazon, and they're not turning profits yet. So this is not attractive right now, only in terms of what it means for the future, and we hope it's a near future, not a distant future.
Well, I will say, I mean, despite what's been said, there are a couple possible bright spots for business cases. One would be for passenger drones, emergency services, and I think it was Boozow and Hamilton did some estimates on this, and they believe this market could be financially viable just because of the cost of today's helicopter emergency services and the maintenance involved. The other in the drone space would be medical product delivery, which you see some companies do this. There's some in the U.S., some in Switzerland. Rwanda is an interesting case. This drone company, Zipline, has been making hospital blood deliveries for a couple years now. I think they do 30% of the hospital blood in the country is delivered via drone. A doctor uses an app, asks for blood, and within minutes it's sent from miles away. And medical supplies, just because of storage requirements and the high cost but low weight of what's needed, could be a viable business fairly quickly.
So briefly, some closing thoughts, and then we'll open it up to audience questions here. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about this space? Why, and what would change your opinion on this?
I'll go for. I am optimistic about this space. I think there are incredibly smart people with an incredible passion for it, working towards solutions, right? And I think they want to get to yes. I think, like I say, the FAA regulators around the world want to get to yes. And so I think working together, you're going to get to a solution, hopefully quicker, like Greg said, hopefully quicker than later. But I think, and that's the issue. Not much would really change that, I think. I mean, not much would change it. I think that's the way. I think I'm comfortable with where we are, and I think that I think we have a path forward, and I think it's going to continue to work toward it. It's going to be iterative. It might not be pretty or in the timeline. We might be in that trough, right, where people don't see the what they want, but I think we'll get there.
I'm cautiously optimistic. I think if a drone tomorrow were ingested in an aircraft engine and 100 passengers and crew would die, for years people have been saying, well, that'd be the death knell of the industry. No, but it'd slow things down, certainly. And there's a tremendously excellent safety record so far for drones, but they've also been under severe operational restrictions, and that's the caution.
So for small drones, I'm fairly optimistic. I think the business cases are pretty good. It's also a fairly low risk technology to be operating, and it's being done it's already starting to be done in many parts of the world, particularly on the medical side. And I think the consumer benefits will be really compelling. On urban air mobility, I'm a little more cautiously optimistic. I think the demand is there for doing these kind of high traffic routes from, say, a central business district to the airport or to a football game. Those are fairly easy to identify. The again, I mean, the air traffic management question is really unsettled. And one thing that makes me optimistic is that in some ways, China appears to be much farther ahead in urban air mobility. They're working on certification to be done this year. They're starting a commercial pilot program, and I think that kind of healthy competition, particularly in this day and age with Chinese companies, will activate U.S. policymakers and make it more of a priority. I looked at Chinese Civil Aviation Authority, and they view autonomous aviation as an area where they can leapfrog America and Europe and Japan, and they've made a priority up there with artificial intelligence and 5G technology. They want to flood the standards bodies before anyone else does, and I think in the long term that'll be healthy for U.S. to have that kind of competition.
All right, gentlemen. Well, thank you very much. I'd like to open it up to audience questions. Yeah.
Yeah, so my question is, I think we generally like a lot of what the FAA has done, right, especially in terms of the safe airspace, but I think a lot of what you all sort of outlined sounds pretty legislative. Is there an argument to be made that the FAA's rulemaking authority is unconstitutional and that we should be going to Congress? I mean, Mr. Walden, like you said, Congress might be asking for sort of a noise reduction. Why not just let Congress do it?
Well, Congress has has put some language on its delegation of authority. The FAA has plenary authority over aviation safety, but it's not simply, Congress didn't say, go and do what's in the public interest. It's very detailed. So I think it would survive a delegation doctrine challenge, even if it were revitalized maybe the way you would like to see it. And I've been toying with that over the years as well, but I think that in the interstate commerce clause and drones, if you say, well, drones are only going to go 5 miles, that's not interstate commerce. Well, it is when it's in the airspace with aircraft that are going interstate. That is not that of a broad construction. So I think in the terms of aviation, the delegation to the FAA is appropriate.
You mentioned kind of the efforts to lobby state governments to start sort of address this new surge of use of drones. I'm curious if you guys could talk a little bit more about the role in cities. If you say lobby Texas successfully, but Austin then creates their own legislation banning the use of drones above its airspace, how that actually plays out.
Well, we, as a coalition, we've gone into some jurisdictions and yes, lobbied the state legislature not to approve a drone restriction, although some states have preempted city and county ordinances. We support state preemption of that. And we have said if you want to criminalize weaponizing drones, if you want to criminalize prohibit drones from operating over and dropping things off into prisons or going over schools, we take, that's okay. Those things are probably already in violation of law. But where we don't like to see a certification regime that is duplicative of the FAA certification regime. and we don't like to see a line in the sky created below which the FAA would not have responsibility, but state and local governments would. There's a lot of concern about a patchwork quilt of state and local regulation, and that certainly applies to manufacturers who want to build a drone that can be operated in 50 states and in all cities and counties within a particular state. With operators, they can deal with local restrictions up to a point. Certainly, if there's a parade and you don't want any drones, there will be a temporary flight restriction that will be issued by a NOTAM or other that will be maybe in the UTM. And when you know your flight plan today is going to go and interfere with that parade, and you would just change your route. So I think there are things that state and local governments can do that will not impede the industry, and that can be worked out. And I think that we don't go proactively and say, here's a model bill. I mean, that was the role of the Uniform Law Commission Drone Tort Committee, which did not succeed, and that was only on drone torts. It wasn't on state and local regulation as such.
I think states are the right. I mean, because these are often intercity services, particularly for urban air mobility. I think the state is the appropriate place to regulate this.
Are there any foreseeable spectrum obstacles, or is the current bandwidth going to be sufficient, or do we have to worry about interference? I'm just curious how the spectrum fits into the puzzle in all of this.
A lot. Right now, what they're using a lot of times is LTE. Right? They're gonna use the spectrum of the cellular networks, and so it might not be an issue necessarily with as far as interference. But I think you're right. This is an area that the FCC so far has kind of not really gotten into. Right? It's kind of said, well, let's see what the FAA is doing. Right? Let's see how the FAA does it. Whereas the FAA turns around and says, well, we're just kind of concerned about its safety, right? So we're not necessarily concerned about whether or not that you can do it. That's the FCC's job. And so recently the FCC and FAA have started to talk, I think, a little bit about exactly how are we going to do this, right? Exactly what do we want to do? If you'll talk to the drone operators, I think most of them are agnostic necessarily. They'll pick the one that's best for them, right? Right now I say it's LTE. They're agnostic as necessarily how it works. They just want to be able to make it work, right? And get some ideas. And right now, like I say, it works now. We'll see what happens, but yeah, I mean, it's a tough call because the FCC is just now starting to get really involved in it, I think.
Yeah, we do think that licensed LTE is the way for low altitude, small drones. When you're in controlled airspace, higher altitudes in the same airspace as the airlines, something more might be necessary, but we're not sure what that's going to be, but definitely spectrum is a critical element of unmanned traffic management.
Yeah, I'm wondering how the data collection issues intersect with law enforcement. I mentioned some Fourth Amendment issues, or maybe more simply, the role law enforcement will play or may play in using drones to enforce laws.
Yeah, I suspect law enforcement will be a major customer of drone services. You're already seeing it. I think there were some news stories about police using drones to follow a suspect on foot or summon a car. Particularly for car chases, it's a much better way than speeding through traffic trying to catch someone. Yeah, I expect they'll be a major customer. As a civil libertarian, I have some concerns about how they're using data collection and warrants and subpoenas when it comes to this privately collected information. But it's not something I've written too much about yet.
I mean, the Supreme Court, you have a few justices who acknowledge that the Katz doctrine and its progeny might need a little bit of an adaptation in the 21st century. And then you had the trespass decision by Scalia in, I think it was Jones, which is, I think that's kind of an outlier, but The Supreme Court is struggling with it, and I would say within the next 2 or 3 years, they'll have to wrestle with it again.
All right, well, we're quickly approaching 1 o'clock, so I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today and thank our panelists for a really interesting conversation and for your time.
Thank you,
Good. Thanks for the questions, including the ones that I didn't expect.
Yeah.
No, that's great.
I appreciate that nobody called out the AOPA.
Because they haven't been. I guess they could be active. They haven't been as active. Nice to meet you.
And I know
There are aircraft owners responsible. The AOPA, I think.
Yeah, they're
yeah, I think there's some crossover. The issue is generally we don't know our general aviation. Once you start going off into areas where you don't have large amounts of aviation, there's a lot less rules. For anything, my 110 miles an hour airplane, I can cut it fast. But I mean, it's wrong, it's catastrophic to me. And I'm much lower speed.
General aviation doesn't want to. We're not operating transponder. That's going to be difficult. And I think the FAA might have to, drones be subject to the regime of airlines. I would say ADS.
all right.
The price will go down where I think $100. I put a lot of money into something. Yeah, it's gonna be safety.
I know.
It is a cloth-covered two-seater built in 1949.
No, but I thought it was down to like $100.
Well, the issue is you can get one about 600 bucks. It replaces one of the lights inside. If you have the right electrical system for it, everything else is good. But on the hodgepodge of not really originally having an electrical system, adding it over time, adding some other things, by the time you get to it now. And so you're effectively, there is a range of aircraft system. Model T is still a lot on the road.
So I'm not a technical person, but I understand that there are these swapping technologies that are a lot less expensive. And it's getting and I think the question is whether the FAA would say, okay, we'll meet the intent of the ADS rule if you're swapping device technology, but it's got to be compatible and again, it's got to serve its purpose.
I suspect it'll be a little bit like riding a horse on your side. You can do it on your own property, but please don't.
Yeah, so this is, we had a big FAA reauthorization after 2018. And so Congress probably won't fool around with it. Also, it's going to be very surgical things over the next 2 or 3 years. Do we have a federal privacy regime? Maybe. industry really wants them. It's hard to get easy. For lawsuits, I think it's going to take a long time to percolate up. I mean, I thought I didn't want any vehicle swap lots. I had 5 reported decisions during the week. But they're different. They're not clean cases, victims. With driverless cars, I had no reported decision. Well, they sell. Lyft writes a check. Lyft writes a check. Done with it. So it's really hard to kind of see where law is going to and law will happen.
That was the motivation behind my question about the business model. Is it seems Tesla's model, which is with autopilot, is just push out the features, and if something bad happens, we'll write them such a check that it doesn't end up in court.
But I mean, the fails or the other aspects that happen in the United States have slowed down that industry dramatically. And they needed to. They would never allow that sort of thing. They're so conservative on what they're about.
I want commercial airliners or London, general aviation. I don't know how you measure per mile, per passenger mile. You seem to tolerate more risk with small aircraft. Will people want commercial airlines or small aircraft?
Yeah, the FAA says, okay, well, it's just the pilot, okay, and the pilot.
Right.
Okay. But if you're in the same airspace with an airliner, now you have the So, but
A lot of that will be too, I think, the industry, kind of like the individual companies will probably say. I mean, for example, Amazon. You know what I mean? They want to be able to say, if they said this, because it's a business. You know, they want to say that. And it would really hurt their business. It was fun. Thank you very much.
where are you going from here?
I gotta go back to the hotel and get my stuff. I'm gonna go to the airport.
I am too. I've got a couple hours, but the weather's not that hot today. So this is venerable where it's a modern building. But I looked at the list of the professors that are along the wall. There's some that I recognize and many that I don't.
We want Shake Shack. We always say from.
You know, I love Shake Shack, but I'm on a health required diet. You know, you probably don't know this, but I lost 32 pounds. Last time I saw you, I had angioplasty.
Oh, did you really?
3 steps. Yeah.
Okay. You have class?
I came this close to a heart attack. So, yeah. So I'm not doing that. I'm doing salads and
I'm glad you got it worked out.
really good.
Yeah, I can't eat meat. I don't eat meat.
Oh, you don't eat meat.
This isn't meat. Oh, that's chicken.
There may be something over there. You came in last night?
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't from Pittsburgh.
Yeah, and I thought, you know, in October I thought, no, maybe not. And I was lucky.
I felt like I actually was delayed like an hour and a half there.
Really?
You know what? But you're like. You know But yeah, check it now. Cool.
Right, okay, yeah, that's true. So kind of like our lives. It's good. It's good. Molly is a John Kelly. Absolutely. Are you doing Greg Kelly?
That's amazing. Yeah, the only Senate campaign I've ever donated to, if it keeps going the way it is, it's impossible. That's amazing. He's White House before this. I really hope. You're all. If you have a card, I'd love to. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'll be sure to send I love that one. Thank you so much, sir. Okay. See what happens. We also might not care. What does that mean? It should be us. It should be Vancouver, Toronto. It does, but I I'd contest you on that actually. I wouldn't say most. I've had because I've talked to
I've taught, I know, that's fine. I've taught anti-homophobia stuff in high school, so it's gonna be a lot worse than that.
Oh, okay,
I
yeah.
think.
On that part, you mean like certification and how opposed they are to that?
Oh, no, I meant like just straight up homophobic love. I was like, like straight away for it. Or whatever it is, boys in a certain identity. I'm Democrat. Like I hope so. I think, no, but overall we're probably better mindset than you in the States. But there's a lot of, I think Canadians sometimes get a little bit like, we imagine ourselves as like, it was pretty similar. Like,